Good afternoon. My name is Jessica Tillotman, and I am the Assistant Dean for Government Procurement Law at the George Washington University Law School. We are delighted to welcome you today to part 2 of our 3-part series on intelligent automation in the U.S. federal procurement system. Today, we have an all-star lineup for you today. Today is our industry panel. It's titled Industry Solutions, Revolutionizing Procurement Business Processes with Intelligent Automation Technologies. Last week, for those of you who may or not been able to join us last week, was our government panel, and it was a really big success. We had a lot of really interesting things that we learned from the lineup. Liz Chirico from the Army talked a little bit about how they're using the Determination of Responsibility Assistant Bot, or DORA, to conduct responsibility reviews and basically cutting down the responsibility determination process through AI from hours and hours, sorting through PDFs by humans to just 5 minutes. We heard from Scott Simpson from DHS, the Office of Chief Procurement Officer and Procurement Innovation Lab, where he talked about how they're using AI right now to assist in the review of Contractor Performance Assessment Reporting System, or CPARS. And then we also heard from Catherine Crompton of the JAIC, where she was talking a lot about all the innovation in the use of AI within DoD. And in fact, she specifically mentioned the creation of a portal called Tradewind, which will allow the JAIC to communicate directly with prospective vendors and stay in touch with those that are already on contract to help basically promote the use and expand the use of AI within DoD. So it was a really fascinating discussion about all the innovative ways. And if you have not been able to watch the first series, I encourage you to do so. It is in recording on the program page for this particular series. You can see it at the bottom, where we will also have the recording of this program as well afterwards. And then again, we also encourage you to join us next week, same time on the 20th. For our third panel that talks about the policy implications and challenges to intelligent automation in the procurement system. So I'll do another plug at the end, but I wanted to get that in there. So without further ado, I first want to introduce my co-moderator of this series, Alex Canizares, who is a senior associate of the law firm Perkins Coie and also an adjunct professor here at GW Law School, and has written and spoken about these issues fairly extensively. So he'll be joining me in the moderating duties, and will be joining us next week as a panelist for our third part of our series. David Kessler is the Vice President and Associate General Counsel, IT and Data Law for BAE Systems, where he handles IT contracts, cybersecurity, data privacy, and supply chain compliance. Chris Nelson leads Microsoft's Compliance Analytics program, which uses machine learning and statistical insights to improve compliance outcomes for the company. He's also a core member of Microsoft's Anti-Corruption Technology and Solution, aka the ACTS program, a 10-year effort to bend the curve of corruption by delivering expertise in anti-corruption technology to governments. Michael Scruggs is the Senior Vice President of Artificial Intelligence within SAIC's Strategy, Growth and Innovation Group. Scruggs joined SAIC in 2021 and is responsible for incubating and leading SAIC's horizontal AI business, comprising solutions related to predictive analytics, machine learning, robotic process automation, or RPA, and intelligent edge. And last but not least, Tifani O'Brien is the Chief Engineer, AI and Machine Learning within Leidos AI ML Accelerator, contributing to AI and ML strategic goals, evaluating emerging technology, and developing research-based solutions for customers. She actually leads a team of data scientists focused on predictive analytics and anomaly detection, currently researching methods of improving availability and efficiency for enterprise IT and network operations. So that is our incredibly impressive group of speakers today. At the outset, we realized that people here have varying degrees of familiarity with this concept of intelligent automation and artificial intelligence and all the other technologies we'll be talking about today. So I have asked my partner, Alex, to just go ahead and give us the briefest of 101s on these concepts so that we have an understanding and a baseline understanding for today's discussion. Alex, take it away.
Thanks, Jessica. And I'll give a few observations from a perspective of a government contracts legal perspective, I guess. One is you can sort of think of maybe two issues that possibly three that are relevant here. One is how is the government procuring AI and machine learning? And I think we're going to get into that today. Another is talking about what sorts of technologies are out there and use cases in the private sector, and what can the government be doing to sort of learn from those things and use those inside the government. And then a third one, which I think is sort of going along in parallel, is the question of regulation and oversight and putting some sort of guardrails around the use of AI and having governance structures in place. And all of these issues are kind of, percolating along in parallel. And so I suspect we'll get into each of those. In terms of putting some definitions on AI and machine learning, that's not necessarily an easy task. I mean, I think certainly looking at the way the government is viewing AI and machine learning, there isn't a universal definition. And I think you can look at DoD has an AI strategy that it released in 2018 that actually has a definition of AI. And there's been definitions now in the NDAA. The 2021 NDAA has a long multi-part definition for what is AI. But it makes it difficult in some respects, especially if you're interested, like I am, in just tracking where is the government spending money, where are the programs that they're spending money related to AI. It may not be easy to differentiate between AI and maybe just software or other types of capabilities. We will be talking about intelligent automation, I think, today, and that's obviously one sort of strand of all of this, using automation types of technologies for to make cognitive decisions that can be applied to business processes. And I know our speakers have a lot of interesting sort of insights into what's going on that level. Another thing I would just say is this is obviously an area of growth. The government is interested in procuring more AI. Industry is interested in supplying it, but I think as we'll talk about today, there are obviously some special challenges that come up related to acquisition, related to process, related to budget. One of the issues that I would just put out there too is just related to non-FAR-based procurement strategies and the extent to which the FAR is sort of part of the solution, part of the problem when it relates to AI. Data rights issues. I think we'll touch on some of the issues related to ethics and responsibility. This is a really emerging issue. How do companies sort of behave ethically and responsibly when they're participating in this area? So I'm sure we'll get further into this, and our speakers have a lot to say. So I think I'll stop there, Jessica, and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Alex. Senior Counsel at Perkins Coie. I butchered his title in the first part, so thanks for that. To my colleague for pointing that out. Okay, let's get started. So I think we're going to go ahead and start first with Tifani. Can you speak about why AI and machine learning technologies are important to businesses? Kind of what are some examples of new or emerging use cases for AI and IA in particular in the private sector that may be of interest to the government as they're continuing to explore this area?
So at Leidos, certainly we get involved with government interest in a wide variety of areas in AI and machine learning. And they go all the way from, obviously things related to procurement and processes through one of the areas I've been focusing on, which is IT operations. How do you improve that with machine learning through autonomous vehicles and predictive maintenance for parts, being able to predict when different kinds of parts are going to fail, or when readiness will fall lower, all the way through into the medical field, where people are interested in using AI to make better decisions about treatments and information, for example, for veterans. So it's a wide number of areas. Something I've seen be of particular interest and that we're using internally and then also bringing to the government where they've asked for it in particular ways relates to robotic process automation and being able to better automate those recurring processes that happen across any large business. And frequently when we have multiple systems that you have to interact with, and you have humans that are spending a lot of time on perhaps transferring information manually between systems and making errors, or reading documents and having to make particular decisions and extract information they then have to enter somewhere else. RPA has proved to be a really effective technology. And the way we measure our success has been by using metrics such as number of hours saved, cost saved, versus the hours to develop these automations. And I know that in Leidos, for example, we're using these for business processes, including, for example, invoice processing, travel authorizations, time card compliance checks, and a variety of other areas like that. It's been very useful. So.
That's great. And given the source of liability that those things can create for a company, that's incredibly important. Michael, let's go with you next.
Jessica?
Same question, basically. Why, what are some examples of use cases or something that's been promising that you've seen within SAIC that would maybe of interest to the government?
I see use cases being defined across a wide spectrum based on the complexity of the outcomes we're trying to achieve. If you look at the continuum, basic use cases that have a lower degree of variation, things like business process automation or software automation or even logistics support, those represent basic static and predictive analytics in those use cases, and are great places to start for organizations who have not been adopting AI as rapidly as maybe the private sector. But if you look at the opposite end of the spectrum, you get into real-time decision support. So if you think about in the DoD world around C2 and BM decision support, you've got big all-domain joint C2 efforts that are looking to connect networks across space. You've got traffic management in the air domain. So the DoD, I think, is looking at utilizing AI to tackle those harder problems that require more evolved technology, deep learning approaches to machine learning. And the technology from a vendor space perspective has gotten really good. And I think we're focused on helping the government navigate that technology space to make sure that they're utilizing the technology for its utmost gain.
Thanks, Michael. And I should make a quick note that if you have any questions for our panelists today on this topic, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. I will be monitoring it throughout, and we will be reserving time at the end to ask questions. So please, again, make use of the chat throughout as questions come to you, and we will get to them. Chris, let's turn to you. You have a bit of a different perspective on this, coming from a kind of compliance anti-corruption perspective. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the use cases you've seen and that might be of value to the government.
Sure. Thanks, Jessica. Thanks for the opportunity to participate today. I think we approach the question of how we're using data and analytics really from the DOJ framework on effective compliance programs is a really nice roadmap to think about opportunities. So we're looking at the role of analytics in a well-designed program, and it's absolutely critical to detecting risks earlier and at scale. And so, specifically, we're really paying close attention to embedding analytics teams with frontline compliance managers and risk managers, taking insights out of those, sort of crime scene kind of moments when something bad is happening. Risks tend to be serial, right? I mean, it's unlikely that if someone in Bolivia has figured out how to game a sales incentive or otherwise engage in improper behavior that someone in Belgium hasn't also figured it out. So if you're not there with that team on the ground with an analytics sort of mindset, asking this question of is this behavior likely to repeat? If it does repeat, can we stop it? We're looking to build systems that align with those sort of pillars of effectiveness. so that when we're in front of regulators and, the first 3 questions they ask you is, if you're in a charging moment or, earlier even, it's like, when did you know it? What'd you do to stop it? And what'd you learn? Right. And so we're really focused on the way in which we can apply analytics to answer those questions effectively. And it has a role across each of the 3 questions.
Thanks, Chris. David, how about you and kind of what you've observed in your role within BAE?
Thank you, Jessica, for the opportunity, and Alex as well for the opportunity to appear on this panel. As a general matter, I guess to answer the question about why it's becoming important to businesses, you have 2 factors. One is the increasing complexity and volume of business information, and then a desire from businesses like ours and many others to garner some degree of insights from previously unmined, if you will, massive amounts, the same amount of data. So you're trying to extract insights that will actually help you in your business grow, make money, save money, or frankly, as a lawyer, keep from getting sued. But in terms of actual potential use cases for AI and intelligent automation, I see them as things like demand prediction, materials requirements, as Tifani pointed out, parts demands, what the life cycle is of a particular part, when it might fail, historical purchase data, use of products. Another one is spend categorization, things like automatically categorizing invoicing data according to standard products and services codes like the United Nations Standard Products and Services Code. RPA, as we've all talked about very briefly already, there's many flavors of that. Price analyses, automated tendering, compliance verification, as Chris was pointing out. And then last but not least, and this is very important to us, is third-party risk management.
That's definitely an area that I know that keeps many companies up at night. So to be able to automate some of these processes are important. So I want to turn to, we talked about some of the kind of increasing use cases, but there are obviously challenges associated with the government acquiring some of these solutions. So maybe, David, I might turn back to you on this. Kind of, what do you see are the biggest challenges to the government acquiring these AI solutions?
Well, as a former chief compliance officer myself at a prior company, compliance obligations are critical to leveraging artificial intelligence and intelligence automation. There's been a massive shift to cloud services, for example, but for government workloads, cloud cybersecurity requirements are substantial. You have things like FedRAMP certified solutions, but then for the DoD, you have to be compliant with the DoD Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide for impact levels 4 and above to handle controlled unclassified information and the like. So if a cloud solution, for example, doesn't meet those because it's more of a commercial cloud solution that provides artificial intelligence or intelligent automation services, the government can't use it because it doesn't comply with their security requirements. And these security requirements get even more complicated in a hybrid model, which we are seeing more and more, whereby governments, I just read a recent article that I can't remember the exact percentage, but a lot of state and local governments have not moved to the cloud because they can't get cloud solutions that are compliant with their security requirements. And federal government is the same way, even though it has adopted a forward-leaning stance on cloud, but many are trying to keep 2 feet, 1 foot I'd say 1 foot, their head in the clouds and their feet on the ground, I think is a better way to put it. So you have a hybrid cloud model where you have to not only meet on-premises security requirements, but also cloud security. So that's a complicating factor.
Tifani, I saw you nodding your head a lot to that. It sounds like some of this sounds familiar to you.
Yes, and I agree with David. I'd say the biggest barrier we've had rolling out some of these solutions has been in the security and information assurance areas. And that's not just in acquiring them, but actually deploying them. And particularly since we're talking often environments, different networks. So it's and spanning networks and spanning perhaps, unclass and security, and classified use cases. So that only increases the amount of trouble. One of the particular challenges that's come up with AI and machine learning has been, or I guess maybe there's a couple here, but one has been with the sort of autonomous agents that are anticipated to go out and perform some of this, this intelligent automation that we want to have happen. And that is a particularly sticky area for your information assurance folks to be able to understand how they can trust. It all comes back to trust in the AI machine learning is everyone knows, a really important item. And how do you trust that an autonomous bot or autonomous agent of any sort, whether it's RPA or something else, is able to, that it's acting correctly, that it has the correct authentication, and that it is able of being monitored, and that people can trust what it does and have a way to review its actions and understand why it made the actions it did, so they can unroll them or improve them in the future. So I think basically the security and trust issues are huge in acquisition, as well as the multiple different networks and environments we're putting them into. And then just a quick one on the second piece, something that that sometimes people lose track of is they're very interested in bringing in these AI machine learning tools and this new capability. Most all of them are very highly dependent on the data that's available. And data management, data acquisition, data governance becomes a big challenge when you're trying to roll out the tool, because frequently the big wins that you see you'll get may involve using data from several different sources. And those owners have to understand and again trust that you're going to hold their data and make it available appropriately and protect it. So I would say anyone that wants to roll out AI machine learning capabilities should first make sure that they appropriately understand the data that they want to use and that that's available.
That was definitely a theme last week with the government panel with regard to the quality of the data, for example, with responsibility determinations, given the gravity of that determination and what the quality of the data that the bot has access to. So I think that is, or even for past performance evaluation. So that's just again and again becomes the common theme, regardless of who we're talking about, government or industry. Michael, do you have thoughts on potential challenges that you see to the government acquiring these solutions?
Absolutely. Data is a big one, but there are two others that are equally important considerations when looking at how to adopt AI in your organization. The next one is around business process, because the value of AI isn't how accurate your decision is or how good your model is, right? It's the speed with which it can be consumed in a business process or a runtime environment. It doesn't do an organization much good to know what the right answer is if you can't figure out how to execute the decision in a business process. So understanding how you're going to consume the output of an AI model is really important to discover and determine at the outset of a project. I've seen lots of projects fail because there was too much emphasis on the science and technology and not enough emphasis on the business architecture or the business process by which you were going to consume the output. And then another area is around talent. The data scientist community is small in comparison to other technologies. And if you think about the ratio between a citizen data scientist and a PhD data scientist, it's like 10 to 1. So consider that as you're embarking on this journey, because there are technologies out there that are low-code environments that can be very quickly developed without the need for deep data science skill sets. So having a good plan for how to onboard that talent, how to retain that talent, and how to grow that talent is paramount to any AI strategy.
Now, Chris, I know that you're coming at this from the compliance perspective, but I guess if we're looking at this from the government lens, what do you see as a challenge to working with governments to get them to embrace or adopt or even have access to some of these solutions, particularly from a corruption standpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, as you noted at the start, we have this, ACTS program, Anti-Corruption Technology and Solutions, which is really an effort to tackle this problem that we're highlighting right now. I'd say it varies quite a bit right off the bat. I mean, the discussions with developed governments are very different than the discussions with developing governments. There are fewer constraints, for better or worse, I think, in a lot of smaller government contexts. In MEA, and some of CEE, and some of the smaller APAC countries, Asia Pacific countries, right? They have different problems. They're at a different point on their sophistication sort of journey. And so we're really looking to help where there's a really great overlap between technology and corruption problems. And that overlap tends to be, pretty significant. Low-hanging fruit abounds, right? Like, some in some government contexts, like procurement, a lot of procurement officers don't know what they should be paying for a ton of sand or some other commodity because they haven't done a good job of matching up their SKUs or their product codes, so that they can't understand whether the deal they're being offered in a particular tender is a good deal for the government or not. So and it ranges all the way up to like advanced graph embedding techniques to understand how suppliers share risks. I mean, that piece of the puzzle is really out there. It's that the government willingness and ability circle of that Venn diagram, that's the harder one to shift up, so it's consistent with where you want to head. And it's a lot of brute force effort. It's a lot of picking up the phone and calling around and finding the right people to talk to, and then taking as much of it as you can and sort of saying, look, we will handle this for you. We will, until you're ready to sort of own the system or the solution or whatever we're doing, whether it's AI or IA, intelligence assistance or something even more basic, putting together in a non-commercial context, the right mix of partners and bringing in local focused experts, whether it's economic experts or whatever, putting together a V team, building a solution, and then not having to, say, look, it's on you to do X or Y, taking as much of that work onto that V team as possible has proven to be the right first step for us.
So it sounds like there's certainly challenges. So we heard a little bit last week about what the government is using these technologies for. So knowing what your experience is right now with what you've been able to use it in your business without obviously having to go into too much specific, but what you've been able to accomplish, knowing where the technology is, what do you see the government being able to adopt going forward? Do you see things that, for example, we haven't talked about yet, other innovations that it could be used for in acquisition planning, purchasing, evaluating offers? Let's go ahead with David. Sure.
I think robotic process automation is probably the low-hanging fruit here. It could be used to reduce basically the amount of non-value adding work. I'm not saying that everybody doesn't have a role to play in an organization, but that a lot of time is unfortunately wasted on manual processes. And so things that robotic process automation could be used for in the procurement context for planning, purchasing, and evaluating offers for the government is things like auto receipt of low dollar goods to ensure on-time payment of suppliers, cleaning up of data in procurement warehouses for, as I mentioned earlier, things like commodity reclassification, auto assigning buyers and other procurement officials within the organization if nobody's on the file, so it's not being worked. Another one is automatic collection of procurement documents for purchasing orders, things like, copy the RFQ, the purchase order, buyer checklists, justifications, Dun & Bradstreet reports, all of the research, I think, that was mentioned by, I believe it was Chris, about, some of the due diligence that needs to be done by contracting officers and their representatives and the purchasing organizations in general. All of that can be automated. And then last but not least is closing out purchasing orders. If there hasn't been any activity under a contract or a particular open purchase order after a certain period of time and the period of performance is passed, that ought to be able to be automatically closed out. such that it doesn't just sit out there on your finance system and get a red flag when an audit comes around.
Alex?
Well, I was just going to pick up on something you said, David, and maybe ask, Michael, Tiffany, or Chris have a comment, but just getting the sort of the government purchaser to understand technology is itself a challenge. And I wonder if you have any observations on how, companies can go about doing that, especially getting to that word trust that I think Tiffany mentioned. There's sort of the trust element. And to the extent that you encounter people who are, skeptical about AI for replacing jobs and that kind of thing, what are your thoughts about how companies can effectively manage that challenge? Michael, maybe I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that we, and I'm sure my colleagues think about regularly. You have a couple of questions in there. The first around, what is the technical acumen of the typical government purchaser? They can't be even near experts in all of the different domains that they have to review and adjudicate and understand and make sure that the purchasing process is underway. With the technology evolving and the emphasis on trust and bias detection within not only the data but the decisions that are being made within the data, my recommendation and where I've seen successes is starting small and iterating, right? So we talked a little bit about basic processes that can be automated. One of my colleagues mentioned just simple document review and doing intelligent document search. In the legal field, that can have huge savings, right? Not only for the end user, but also for the organization as a whole, because you will start to build a layer of trust in decision making that you didn't get in your first project, but your third project you will.
I think maybe if we could turn to Tiffany to also pick up on that thread about how do you continue to build trustworthiness, transparency, and control for bias? I mean, what are your recommendations in this area as well?
So, and this sort of relates to what Michael was just talking to as well. I'd start with, it's been a successful way for us to speak to people that are looking at bringing AI and machine learning into their environment to talk about sort of a dial that you can set. You start with perhaps assisting the folks in their regular day-to-day jobs. How do you make it more efficient? You can move to then augmenting, giving them new capabilities. For example, anomaly detection over data that's able to point out to them, to highlight to them unusual characteristics. For example, what I'm talking about here is perhaps you have a lot of distributed folks, different offices that are entering codes for particular types of activity, but you find that some are using them in different ways, and you suspect that perhaps they need additional training. So you might say, are there some locations that seem to have an unusually low number of this type of activity? And if you don't believe that there's a reason for them to have a low number, and instead it's a training issue, you can then adjust it. So augmenting capability here in this case would be being able to give the user, point them toward these anomalies. So we're giving them additional capability, but we're not taking over for them yet. And then you move into, higher up on the dial, you start actually automating. And that's the point when you have, more trust in what you're able to do. And you can say, okay, this particular activity, I would like the autonomous process to go out there and, perhaps actually fix these particular data entries that we feel were incorrect, because I have trust at this point that we know what they are and that this is the correct way to fix them. So a dial from assistance to augmentation to finally autonomy is perhaps a good, useful way for folks to think about how to bring these new capabilities into their organizations.
So switching gears a little bit, Chris, let's talk a little bit about the role of, and one of the areas which as the person that teaches the anti-corruption and compliance courses at the school within procurement, I'm most fascinated about are the potential capabilities from a government compliance, anti-corruption perspective, and really what the impact could be on enforcement, because it's not just in the United States who's experimenting. We're experimenting with past performance and responsibility and all those things, but there are many other facets to ensuring compliance with government requirements from a government procurement perspective. And ultimately, it should lead to some different changes in enforcement. I'd love your thoughts on that.
You're talking about it from the supplier perspective, Jessica? Like how can supplier?
I think it could be really both. I mean, how do we minimize risk from a compliance perspective, but also what can government do to improve its understanding of how to ensure compliance with honestly with its contractors too. So I think it could be both.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, it's a huge problem space, of course. Procurement is is just incredibly complex, and it varies globally quite a bit. From very early 1980s e-commerce style systems like the dawn of the internet to really incredibly sophisticated systems that have cartel screens built in and have structural impediments or blockers anyway to collusion, coordination, all the stuff you want to avoid. So it depends first of all on what kind of procurement system you're looking at, but really just sort of dialing it back a bit. We think about, I think that in procurement particularly, which is really this hyper specialized area where politicians are delegating to, internal bureaucrats who become and then there's contract seekers. And it's this very insular kind of world, right? Where there's a bunch of information asymmetry between that little specialized world and everybody else, the enforcement teams, so transparency is the first place that we're going to look for applications of technology, generally speaking. And there's ex ante transparency and ex post, right? And so really transparency before the fact, where you can start to think about ways to lightly introduce technology in maybe even corruption adjacent spaces, not sort of saying like, we're going to build you the world's best cartel screen that will automatically tell you when you're being hoodwinked, right? So that's not the place to start from a trust development perspective, particularly. It's a notoriously long process. So we're going to want to start by looking at small nudges in behaviors or improving transparency at the outset, so that expert community, that insular procurement community, I think there's pretty good research out there that they're more likely to do something with information than the ex post transparency crowd, which is enforcement and civil society and journalism. Like ex ante is really the opportunity to improve the sort of, I guess you would say, the impact of that increase in transparency, because in a lot of places there are people who aren't willing or able or capable of participating in some sort of a kickback scheme. It raises prices, and cheating theoretically should be something that a lot of companies want to do, new entrants or existing companies. So really trying to give the most information to those people is I think the right first approach in a lot of contexts.
I bet a lot of governments could really benefit from some sort of technology to help them identify collusive schemes, given how difficult it is to detect, because it often looks so normal from the surface, and it's only after time do you detect the patterns. So, all right, let's shift gears. We got a few questions coming in, and again, keep them coming, and then we will turn back to some additional questions. Sandeep asks, from an enforcement perspective, is it likely that the DOJ will increasingly expect companies to have analytic capabilities to deploy such capabilities fully across their enterprises to prevent and detect government contracts fraud and other types of misconduct? I'll go with one of the lawyers on the panel. We'll go with David.
Sorry, Jessica, can you repeat the question? I just want to make sure I understand what Sandeep's asking.
Sure. Sandeep basically asked, from an enforcement perspective, is basically DOJ increasingly going to expect companies to have these analytic capabilities to prevent and detect government contracts fraud and other types of misconduct? Is that now going to become a baseline expectation? Whereas now it seems to be this kind of, especially with larger companies, something that companies are doing and increasingly doing, but will it become a baseline expectation almost? I hope
I don't know. I don't know that it necessarily will become a baseline expectation, but rather they're going to stick with the rules that are technology agnostic. I'm not saying that they don't care how you do it. They certainly want to know how effective your compliance program is writ large, and whether or not, as Chris has pointed out, whether or not you are taking effective steps to root this out. But they do, and again, I'm not necessarily going to speak for the DOJ and other enforcement authorities here, but my experience with them has been that they do want to see what you're doing from a reasonable business perspective to stay on top of the issue. And if there are automated tools out there that all of your competitors may be adopting, or that industry in general has adopted, but you haven't, they may at least want to know the answer to the question as to why. And in some cases, it could be, as Tifani has pointed out, there could be a security reason, a cybersecurity reason why you're not leveraging cloud solutions or a hybrid cloud solution to do something that in the commercial space might be acceptable, but in the government contractor space is not. So I think that the authorities are probably going to look at things on a case-by-case basis. I don't know that they've necessarily set a technological floor, because at the end of the day, the government itself is one of the slower entities to adopt new technologies, and is relying on industry to help guide them in terms of what best practices are.
Chris, do you have your thoughts on that as far as a company perspective about the need to have some of these technologies in place, given the enforcement environment?
Well, I mean, so if you're saying like, our government's going to start expecting or requiring the companies self-police or have some minimum set of anti-corruption or compliance related technology solutions in place. I mean, I think the answer is probably not for a while, at least not unless they want to severely limit the qualified supplier list that they can go to. There's just a host of reasons why it's impractical to require that. I think, so if you take a look at something like the DOJ guidelines, right, they're asking open-ended questions about, and giving companies discretion to answer them in whatever way makes sense for them in their particular industry on their journey with technology. I mean, it's going to be very different for Microsoft, of course, and it should be then for, an asphalt supplier or, or a defense contractor. Each of those companies is going to have a different set of expectations when you're in front of a regulator, if you ever are, and you're looking back and asking, what did you do? Was it effective? What did you learn from it? So I think the most important thing is to think about those, do a red team, blue team sort of exercise and think about what are you going to say if you're asked those questions by a regulator like DOJ? Are you going to be able to answer them? And if not, do a gap analysis. And if not, you start to just tackle those gaps one by one. So, do we have teams who are focused on postmortems and root cause analyses, right? Do we have teams who are asking this question like, hey, could data actually have given us a heads up in this case? Do we have a good partnership with controls and governance teams so we can pass learnings to them and say, look, this is a business process problem. This has happened twice. We think it's going to repeat again. Our ability to control it really rests on your shoulders because you control the incentive structure or the business. I mean, those are the kinds of exercises that I think are, should be and probably are going to be rewarded by regulators when you're at the table across from them in that bad moment.
So turning to a question that we received in the chat, given that considerable innovation is happening in startups and small businesses, what are the particular challenges for these businesses to work with government? What are some of the approaches to help streamline this? Michael, you started to answer this in the chat, so I was hoping that you could kind of elaborate on your response.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. And I remember working for a small business several years ago in my career. So first, as I mentioned in the chat, you've got to build relationships with the small business liaison officers within the agencies that you want to do business with, also with the GSA, but also, your innovation is not only necessary, but it's actually desired in the federal system integrator community, because we all have varying levels of expertise, but the small businesses who are more agile, if you will, to bring innovation to their customers is always something that we're looking for and weaving into our fabric of solutions. So the first part of the answer is you've got to get to know your customer, and your small business liaison officer can help you with that. your federal system integrator community is also looking for innovation from small business. There are even requirements for large businesses to bring subcontractors on that meet certain diversity requirements, size of company requirements. So, there are avenues. Some of the challenges, as I recall, is, being focused. You can't, as a small business, you can't be everything to everybody. You've got to find your niche. You've got to do it better than anybody else. So, one recommendation is stay focused, stay in your area of expertise, be very deeply experienced in that area, and then bring it to the areas and the customers and your partners that have a gap in those areas.
Tifani, do you have anything you want to add to what Michael is saying?
Yeah, just to add what he's saying, I very much agree. As another large business, we look to partner with the small businesses that are bringing innovation. I will say there's particular contract vehicles that encourage that, OTAs, AIEs, things like that, that are looking for non-traditional businesses to partner with someone who is a traditional defense contractor or something, and be able to bring their technology in. And obviously, we like those because this is a chance to work with very fresh, interesting, state-of-the-art technology. Our customers are happy with it, and what we're able to offer in that case is often the knowledge about how to best integrate into government systems in a variety of ways, and that includes all the way through invoicing and contracting and all that, all the way through their actual physical systems. And this comes back to the places where we often have to do the most work when we partner with those kind of folks is in, at least in my experience, in the information assurance and security area, because there are a lot of requirements on the government side that you don't have on the commercial side. And so I would say if you were a small company that was interested in doing that sort of thing, to look ahead of time and start looking at what's required for information assurance, and start addressing that within your product, and you'll be a huge step ahead.
So Tifani, you mentioned other transactions, and I thought that sort of brought up the question that I raised at the outset about sort of non-FAR-based procurement methodologies. And David, Michael, or Chris, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this. I mean, we're talking about this revolutionary technology, and people are still dealing with an acquisition system that is predates all of this technology. So I'm curious to get your perspectives on, to what extent do we need to take a drastically new approach, or is the FAR sufficient? I mean, how do you balance that? Obviously, it's not an either or scenario, but the JAIC in particular within DoD has really seized on OTs as being a really malleable, flexible tool to get this technology. So, Michael, I'll turn it to you if you have any thoughts on that issue.
Just in general, at a high level, I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. The technology will always evolve. The technology will be different in 2 years than it is today. And generally, it will be more powerful. But no matter how good your technology is, if you can't adapt your business process and, more importantly, your policies, right, to keep up with the technology, you will always be limited, and you'll be limiting the power of the technology. And so focusing equally, not only on technology adoption, but also organizational change management and policy inspection is, I think, even more important than the actual technology adoption, because you just can't get to where you need to be operating on 20-year-old policies. I'm sure that there are a lot of people thinking about this problem in government, and industry is here to help. I haven't seen a lot of appetite for actually changing policy at the rate we actually need to.
I'm gonna listen to David's thoughts on it. I would just say that was a theme last week, where, for example, DHS is using this amazing tool to help it with its review of past performance data, but the FAR has not caught up. And in fact, there's a pending FAR case right now just to amend the law to get it to use it for just such basic purposes that seem straightforward, but so complicated. David, do you have thoughts on Alex's question?
Yeah, I think this harkens back to the days of FASA and FARA roughly, I guess, 25 years ago, 1994, 1996, where the government went through a similar struggle regarding commercial items in the wake of, I guess it was the $600 hammer and the $2,300 toilet seat. I think all of us are well aware of those. I think we're at a similar inflection point now with things like AI, machine learning, cloud. We are going to have to, the government's going to have to get faster in terms of updating things. FASA and FARA took, I don't know how many years to finally put into place. And we've reaped the benefits of them for the last, we have FAR Part 12 and that gets amended, but it takes, whatever it is, I guess a year, 2 years, sometimes 3 or 4 to get a new FAR clause put into place that allows for the acquisition of certain technologies. But by that point, the technologies have moved past that FAR clause. And, no, we can't get around the Administrative Procedure Act. I mean, it is an essential way of getting insight. But I do think one way to help the government tailor its procurement processes is for industry participants to weigh in on, public rulemakings, provide comments on the acquisition rules, get involved, get more involved. If they can't or don't want to get directly involved, they should work with their trade association and industry associations to make their viewpoints known, such that the regulations can get tailored to what industry is doing, as opposed to industry having to tailor itself to what the government's doing.
So admittedly, when I hear, I feel like the doom and gloom person on the panel, but when I hear increasingly partner with innovative small businesses and use non-FAR-based, I guess we call it acquisition vehicles, because it's not FAR-based procurement, like other transactions, a lot of people get really excited because it allows you that flexibility to be innovative. And of course, from a risk perspective, I think, oh, innovative business that doesn't know anything about the FAR or its requirements, and oh my goodness, other transactions and the potential risk because we're deviating from some of the controls that have been developed over decades in the FAR. So I guess I'll turn this over to Chris. What are your thoughts on that as companies continue to want to partner with suppliers that are innovating in this area? But then the additional supply chain risks and contractor risks that come with that, or even using other vehicles.
So could you just repeat the very first part of that, Jessica, one more time? I got the last part, but I missed the very first.
Sure. So I mean, I guess as companies, because all of you are representing very large companies, as you continue to partner with smaller companies, even innovative ones that you are really excited to work with because of their innovation, but maybe are less familiar with the rules and framework of the U.S. system or the procurement rules in other governments. How do you balance that risk?
Yeah, so yeah, supply chain and partner, lifecycle management in our own sort of resale channels. We have devote a huge amount of thinking and effort to that space. I can say absolutely there is no perfect solution to this. It's a team effort, and I believe it starts with tone from the top, right? And getting your executives bought into this idea that, we're not out here to maximize revenue. We're out here to maximize compliant revenue, right? It goes without saying, but sometimes it needs to be said. So, we're really focused on making sure we identify the ways in which being compliant is a benefit to us. It's a competitive benefit to us as a supplier, as a government supplier, particularly. So when we do, an emergent risk assessment, or we come in with some data and analytics, we're always looking for ways to quantify the gains to being more compliant or to changing a business process, and they're often there. I mean, we don't tend to, just generally speaking, companies don't tend to do better when they loosen partner entry requirements, or they don't reach out and have active lifecycle management of their partners. Most of that is just all risk, right? I mean, there's not a terrible amount of upside in not managing your partner community effectively. So, trying to look for the way to sort of reduce the compliance as a tax conversation, or at least offset it by pointing out some gains. That's been critical for us in shifting, attention to this space and getting buy-in. When we look at an OKR or a KPI or whatever, like some sort of, business, like we must have this process like this, or we must have this partner. We, stepping back and saying, really, like, is that actually true, or is that just something that, you believe because we haven't looked very closely at the alternatives to it? These are all, great discussions to have to help the company start to sort of drive from the top down towards more compliant supply chain practices, which is critical. It's really hard to do bottom up.
So I want to shift gears a little bit. The conversation that continually comes up as we've been preparing for this series with all the panels is workforce. What is the impact on the workforce? How do you prepare your workforce? What are some of the challenges with regard to your workforce when it comes to the use of these technologies? So Tifani, I was going to go ahead and start with you on that question.
So we've developed an upskilling program, and I'm sure a lot of folks have as well, specifically in the data science disciplines, because a lot of the workforce is very interested in learning more and being able to become those citizen developers. As we get more tools that are, as was referenced, low code or no code tools that sort of make it available for the end user to have a better chance of actually developing their own AI and machine learning assisted capabilities, folks are interested in learning about it. So that upskilling program involves, of course, training. Fortunately, there's a good deal of free training as well as paid that's available. And so providing that has really helped. And then as well as attracting, the right kind of folks that are interested in these new technologies, and doing that through, showing that you're interested in actually applying these, and open to the business process changes that Michael's rightly pointing out need to happen. So I'd say that that's probably the first step for us.
Michael, do you have additional thoughts on this as well?
I think that was well put. When we talk, just to expand on the upskilling, because we do a lot of that too. There are basic skill sets that are great springboards into this domain. Anything around data management, even database administrator types who have the passion for driving insight out of data, right? Taking the next step with your data are great places to start. The other consideration that comes to mind is academia is really they're doing a great job in bringing these skills to the forefront of their STEM programs, and just in early year academia, much less the university community. But we've got a program dedicated to bringing people right out of university into a paid internship type program, which many times results in having them on staff within 6 months. And so we're putting a lot of emphasis into that. We invest in that quite heavily. And I think that we'll see a tide change shortly when the demographic of university folks catch up to the demand signal that's coming out of corporate America and government.
And I guess, we're always talking about the challenges of a trained, acquisition workforce. That's just a perennial issue of making sure people have the appropriate training in this really complex area. So I guess, we heard a little bit about from the private sector, but David, do you have thoughts on what maybe the government could do to help improve in this area as well?
Yeah, in terms of training up its workforce, not everybody has to become an AI or machine learning expert or data governance expert. I think that you hire folks. The government, for example, many agencies have now hired their first chief data officer to help with corralling, a century's worth or more of agency data that can get put into a useful form. And those individuals have to proselytize across their agencies in terms of the advantages of AI and ML. We just hired our own first chief data officer here, and he's doing the exact same thing. But not everybody has to. I think that there are people who have domain expertise in their particular areas, whether it's somebody in your finance department, somebody in the procurement department, somebody in the security department, the IT department, the physical plant and facilities department. They all actually do play a role in developing AI and IA and machine learning systems within your organization. And in fact, I dare say that they should be part of the procurement process involving the acquisition of artificial intelligence and machine learning systems, because I think that without that diversity of viewpoints or a multidisciplinary team, you're only going to have a partial equation, and you may end up buying an AI or an ML tool that doesn't really overarchingly serve the needs of the organization. It is, for all intents and purposes, divorced from reality. So you have to be very careful. And then there's also a second component to that. And it's also, you know, a diverse team of different genders, ethnicities, socioeconomic backgrounds, and the like that could be involved with helping design the strategy around what tools and processes need to be automated and why.
I'm going to turn back to one of the questions from the chat. And again, if anybody has questions for our panelists, please feel free to put them in the chat. We are going through them. We have the question, what are the panelists' thoughts on AI reviewing RFP responses and selecting award nominees? David nodded his head, so I'm gonna take that as the equivalent of a hand raise.
All right. You have to be very, very careful about leveraging AI and ML in evaluating tender responses or solicitation responses. We've all read the articles about bias, and I think, in fact, a question came up in the chat much earlier in this session about bias in terms of utilizing AI and ML tools. And so that's why having a diverse team up front, both multidisciplinary, but also of different backgrounds, is essential to trying to minimize the amount of bias that is in a system. And that also translates into evaluating RFPs. I guess the closest corollary to that in the private sector is utilizing AI and ML to sort resumes. You know, it's clear from some of those experiences. I believe Google had one, or there was an article on them where it talked about the fact that, unfortunately, there was bias that was in the sorting to begin with. So you have to design the system up front. I think at this point in time, the evaluation of solicitation responses may very well be a culling, but not necessarily a decision. You can't have a contracting officer in a box yet.
Tifani, do you have any thoughts on that?
So what David brings up is, bias, which is one of the big areas that people are very concerned about right now, obviously, in applying automated methods. And I will say I've seen applied, so bias has to be, you have to define what bias means and what bias you're trying to avoid in your particular situation, and then design both a set of training data to allow you to evaluate how well your automated system is doing on it, as well as setting up tests. I've seen, so for example, in one situation, we have there's a government entity that has set up a particular set of tests for a particular scanning system. And the tests are intended to make sure that the system, that the people that are applying, you know, their technological approaches do not bring biased systems in there. And so the tests specifically ask that different situations apply, and that that the system is tested and replies in a particular way that shows that it doesn't have particularly defined types of biases. Now, I think that that's probably a good way to assure some fairness and that you're getting what you want when you're acquiring a system. But the problem is, how do you find biases you didn't know you had and weren't expecting? And that's very hard, and still an area of research, I think.
So just picking up on the sort of issue of source selection, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on the issue of responsible AI. This is an area that DoD in particular has been focused on in terms of ethical development of AI, using ethical principles for the deployment of AI. And one issue that if you start to look at the solicitations that DoD is issuing, they're actually including the ethical principles into those RFPs, with the sort of implication that this may become an issue in terms of the source selection. It's almost like a competitive issue in terms of evaluating offerors. Eventually, maybe a metric for evaluating whether companies are performing in accordance with their contracts in terms of ethics and responsible AI. So maybe Michael, I'll turn it to you, but do you have any comments on sort of how do you approach this question of responsible AI? How do you see this issue kind of developing, and does it become, to what extent does it affect competitiveness in the government market?
Yeah, again, I'll go back to kind of a recurring theme around policy changes to accommodate for new developments in technology. There is technology to protect against bias, unconscious bias. And it's actually getting quite advanced with some of the platform providers understanding that the technology is so good at what it does, it can be kind of turned on its side to hold itself accountable, to make sure that its models are producing the right results, and then being able to deconstruct the models to understand exactly what data attributes are being used. Is one attribute being used more often than not? Is it appropriate to use that attribute in its decision-making process? And this notion of accountability within the model execution process is something that we're starting to look at being part of our DevSecOps procedure. That is a methodology by which we build these systems and these systems of systems. And so when you treat it as part of the DNA of the systems that you're building, things start to change. Ignoring it is no longer an option. The technology is getting good enough to enable you to address it and to ensure that you're holding the decisions that are being made within these systems accountable for doing the right thing.
Chris, I didn't know if you had any follow-up on that, because there was also a question that was to you that's somewhat related to it about, I'm going to find it now, on containing unconscious bias to get to equitable compliance. So I don't know if you want to either further address what Alex asked or go with the chat question.
It's something we think a lot about. We have to. Microsoft has a whole set of responsible AI principles around, fairness, reliability, safety, transparency. All of that applies, absolutely. Bias is a serious risk, particularly when you're replacing human judgment or attempting to do what the questioner asked, which is, developing an automated process that would select RFPs. If you think about the question of which RFP is the best one in this particular, bid or tender, that's a huge multidimensional question that spans price, and it spans reliability, and it spans the needs that you have, and the timing, and all of these dimensions. And the bigger the question you take, and the more shortcuts you take to getting at an answer by looking at, I guess I would call them basic attributes, the bigger the risk that you're going to run right into a bias that you didn't anticipate, and you almost never do. I mean, no one is very few people, I hope, are intentionally designing biased, ethical or unethical AI systems, right? They're coming at this with a reasonable hypothesis and a fair question, but they end up taking shortcuts to the answer, and it's a hard answer with, like I said, all of these dimensions. So I think the answer, the solution, if there is one, and I don't think that there always is one, but taking a step back and looking at simpler questions in the context of an RFP specifically, is the price I'm being offered a fair price, right? That's going to be an easier question to answer without running into bias. I'm not saying you won't, but it will be an easier question than, is this RFP the right one for me? Or do I do better or worse from a completion on time and within the bid amount when a contract contains a clause like this, or I do a 3-lot tender instead of a single lot tender. I don't know. I mean, trying to sort of like start by answering simpler questions that are less vulnerable to that multidimensionality problem, I think is one sensible approach to this challenge.
Tiffany, I didn't know if you had any additional thoughts on that.
Yes, and just to, I think, getting to what Chris was talking about, we've been looking at, in this terms of responsible AI, the amount of risk makes a big difference. And I think what he was going toward is there's perhaps, if you have a lower amount of risk, you could do more automation. High amount of risk, you really want to keep the human in the loop. You know, if you're talking a weapon system, you know, obviously, I personally, I don't think we're beyond the point of having the human in the loop. So we're still at that point of providing them additional information so they can more quickly oversee the decisions that are made and understand what's happening. And then you add, to be responsible, you also are monitoring how well you are responding to adaptation, basically adapting to changes in the environment over time. This gets back to sort of the bias questions as well. If your system has been trained on a certain type of data, you know, from a year ago, and it's been, you know, it did very well the first few months, but then things changed, is your model able to, and I think Michael addressed some of this, is your model able to understand that it's no longer working with data that it has a high confidence on, that it's likely to make decisions that are not as good. And for this reason, that transparency of being able to present, both be able to understand that you're now working with data that's not similar to what you were trained on as a model, and then making those confidence measures available to the end user so that the human is able to review and see that the model is still making recommendations, but now perhaps it's not as confident in what it's recommending, and they should, you know, spend a little more time and have more review. And then, so the human in the loop, along with, you know, understanding the risk of the particular process that you're automating. I think those two together, we're going to be having humans in the loop for a long time.
David, I wanted to get your thoughts too, if you have any on this topic as well.
Yeah, I think Tiffany and Chris and Michael all nailed it pretty well. The idea here is that the human part of the equation can't be eliminated right now. It is essential on the front end, but it is also essential on the back end. Artificial intelligence and machine learning can certainly assist in the procurement process, but it is a tool to be used by human beings right now, not the other way around.
So one of the themes last week that became readily apparent based on just following the chat function in the session with the government speakers was how siloed the government was in its experimentation and use of some of these technologies. Like individual groups within agencies were using it, and some were and some weren't. And it did sound fairly small on some level. And I could see chat function, people were asking, well, can we get access to that? Or how do we learn more? How does my agency do that? And I guess I'll go back to Michael that also mentioned, you know, it's all about kind of starting small with the government rather than kind of these big endeavors, which appears to be what's happening. But I guess given that there seems to be this desire on the part of other procurement offices within the government to do these sorts of things, what do you recommend in your experience, having worked with the government on a lot of different things? What would be your suggestion for how to move things forward where there seems to be they're running into lots of roadblocks?
Yeah, the emergence of new roles, new leadership roles within organizations, including the government. I think a chief data officer really didn't exist 5 years ago, right? The chief AI officer didn't exist. So, you know, I think it's incumbent on senior leadership to define what their AI strategy is going to be. You know, the chief data officer, his or her first priority is going to be governing, securing, centralizing, and then federating their data and making it accessible, making it safe, making it trusted. The chief AI officer is going to make sure that there aren't 15 different AI systems in play at the agency. It may take a while to consolidate them, but they will be consolidated. And it's actually the right thing to do. An enterprise platform that is available and democratized for each of the agency is the right thing to do. It just those things that takes full consideration to make sure that it will, enter and don't wind up just contributing to this notion within the agency.
David, I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that as well.
No, I think Michael nailed that one.
Chris, kind of turning back to it, because I know that you often try to work with governments to try to improve some of these processes. What do you see as kind of roadblocks to governments taking the technologies on and implementing them? And I know you said a lot of it also depends on the quality of their system, considering that some people are probably still using an Apple IIc, but maybe not everybody. That was actually the computer we had in my home growing up, so I remember it fondly, and my dot matrix printer. But I mean, going forward, as clearly governments are interested, and particularly in the U.S. government, the government is interested, the procurement officials are interested. So what can be done, do you think, to help more effectively to promote this?
It's a great question. I mean, it's one of the biggest learnings we've had with the ACTS program in the first year or so is just how difficult opportunities discovery is, right? I mean, it's really hard to get in the room with the right people around the table to find the best chances to move forward together. So that's the first thing I think that you have to focus on is how are you, I mean, both on the government side, like, do you have teams who are, keeping their eyes open for opportunities to solve, important or emergent risks using data? Do you have that mentality on the team that's like, hey, could we do this different or better if we just took a look at some data, or we just tweaked our process and then did some A/B testing to see which one was, the better of the two? I mean, those teams inside governments that have that curiosity, and then trying to find them, and that's the first really important challenge that we're facing from our perspective. And then setting expectations, I think, is also really important about solutions and whether or not they scale, and about are we going to hit a home run or a single and call that success, right? I mean, so artificial intelligence is a very loaded term. It has a lot of around the edges. It scares a lot of people from a job security perspective. It sets these really lofty expectations. So again, trying to say, look, we're going to build this, and then we're going to build it again, and then we're going to build it again, and we're going to continue to work on this together. And that's what you should expect, because that's the road we're going to have to go down to make this fit to go with your flows, right? I mean, if you go in and you're immediately cutting against some important priority or OKR, you're not going to have a lot of success, helping people use technology, right? You have to figure out ways to inject into systems that help them be better in the direction they're headed, rather than, trying to change their flow so dramatically that it's just a non-starter for companies. And then I just say really quickly, the last piece is finding the right tech. I mean, there's in Microsoft stack alone, let alone like the open source world, there is extraordinarily advanced, APIs in Azure that you can call to do image matching and, document matching with like advanced algorithms on which two documents are most similar. I mean, a lot of that stuff is amazing, and it is applicable to corruption problems, but you don't always need to start at the top. You can look for ways to inject technology lower down. And so that's probably what I would say are the three most important factors from our perspective.
So Chris, I wanted to pick up on something David mentioned, I think at the very early stage of the presentation about the cloud. And I'd be curious to get your perspectives about how important the cloud is to all these initiatives, because The cloud is obviously an area of tremendous interest in the government, and there's a lot of different agencies that are interested in the cloud. There's also a lot of, as David was referring to, cybersecurity related concerns and overlay of sort of compliance issues related to FedRAMP. But can you just comment about, I guess, in terms of the government strategy for adopting, deploying AI, what's the significance of the cloud? What are some of the roadblocks?
Sure. I think it is significant and critical. I think it really boils down. I mean, when you say cloud is also a huge term, and it applies to a lot of different aspects of the revolution from 15 years ago to today. But the two most important I would point to, or maybe the three, are: one, the cloud enables you to put data sets together, right? To de-silo yourself and to sort of just solve for that problem. Like, different servers under desks have different kinds of data in them, and they never see each other, and therefore you're missing connections that are critical. And then two is scalability, I would say, and also ease of, and the third is, which is slightly related, is prepackaged techniques and APIs that combined with open source really give you access to this incredible library of solutions if you know which one to go look at, right? There are, like I said, you can, with in a low code, no code posture, right? You can tap into, some of these tech stacks, cloud, algorithms that really have revolutionized image matching or document matching or natural language processing or biometric. I mean, like, it's all out there already ready to be tapped into. And that's the other piece of cloud that's been so critical, is getting up on an advanced technology stack more quickly and with much lower costs than before.
Within the last few minutes, I wanted to give a chance for our panelists and my co-moderator for any concluding thoughts. If you have any specific things that you didn't get to say today or about this subject that you feel like they should know this, the audience should know this, or the people watching the recording should know this as they walk away. It could be no thoughts at all.
So I will offer that when I've seen the solutions deployed effectively, we just talked about this a little bit. You have sort of the top-down push. I've seen it with, for example, AI ops. Automating IT operations with AI and machine learning and improving them from the top down, saying I want higher system availability and greater efficiency. From the bottom up, you see pulling up the use cases from the folks that are actually affected, and then you can sort and address those use cases based on impact. Highly important is identifying metrics with those use cases. That really helps to show how effective and where you're being effective. And those metrics in that particular case, for example, being number of hours saved by a particular automation, or number of corrections that were reduced because of a particular automation, a different automation. So I would just suggest that a way to make this successful is identify your use cases and make sure to point out which metrics are going to show you the success, and use those to prioritize what you're bringing in first.
Well, Tiffany left us with some great things to think about. So I'm always big on ending on time. So I want to take a moment just to say again, thank you to this fantastic panel for all of your thoughts and for your time and contributions today. This is obviously a really important topic that we will continue to do programming on and discuss and learn more about. So that also, thank you to my fantastic co-moderator, and thank you to all of you who joined us today. If you know somebody who was unable to attend today, we will have the recording up on the program website within the next 24 hours. So again, thanks to everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.
Everybody.